In two previous videos, we covered Wallace Stevens' prose essay, The Figure of the Youth as Virile Poet, in which Stevens compared and contrasted philosophy and poetry and tried to give an account of poetry as concerned with truth and reality, as presenting the unofficial view of being in contrast to philosophy's supposedly official view of being. We saw how Stevens argued that the imagination has as much potency for providing us with truth and a relationship to reality as does reason. Now, in this video and in the following one, what I want to do is put these ideas to the test by looking at Stevens' actual poetry, and in particular, what's often regarded as his most challenging and greatest poem, entitled Notes Toward a Supreme Fiction. And a lot of what I'm going to be doing here is going to be a very personal reading of this poem. I don't want to claim that this is the ultimate final word. I don't want to claim that there is such an ultimate final word or interpretation on this poem. I don't want to claim that this is Stevens' intentions that I'm always representing. I don't want to claim that what I have to say can be verified by appeal to the voluminous scholarship on Wallace Stevens, by comparing his influences, by comparing his own remarks and comments on this poem, by looking at his other poetry and how it relates and how it anticipates this poem. All that stuff can be found, and of course it's perfectly legitimate to draw on that in the interpretation of this poem. But rather, my approach is going to be to look at this as a piece of philosophy just like any other, and to look and see what kind of argument, even if it is in a poetic form, is contained here. What is contained in his use of words? What kind of responsibility to the language is exhibited in the words he chooses? What kind of vision of reality is he putting forth? And why does he expect us to find this vision of reality convincing? Now, there will be places where I will frankly admit if I do not understand, do not follow which way he's going. What I'm attempting to do here is in part to dispel some of the anxiety that you might naturally feel if you're new to modernist poetry, the sense that it's over your head, that you can't read this stuff, you can't make head or tails of it, and that your own personal reaction or impression of it is obviously invalid because you're not a scholar, you're not a person who has a deep knowledge of all of the author's influences and background and other work and so forth. Now, there is a time and a place for that, certainly, but I think ultimately poetry has to speak to us. It has to suggest to us something in it that's true. It has to provide pleasure. We have to be in touch with the way it acts on us. Otherwise, it could be the greatest scholarly exercise in the world. It could be the most refined, the most cultivated exercise in illusions that has ever, been seen on the planet. But it wouldn't have really much value, in my opinion. So, without in any way diminishing the value of the scholarship that would go into a strict scholarly reading of his poetry, I'm going to be approaching this as a philosopher, as someone who is interested in what is ultimately real. If there is no ultimate reality, how can we know that? How do we get in touch with what is ultimately of value in life? Or if there is no ultimate value in life, how do we come to know that? You'll recall that in the description of this course, I quoted from Wallace Stevens, and the quote roughly expressed the idea that once one has given up a belief in God, poetry takes the place as life's redemption. So let's take him seriously on that point. What in this poem could possibly be redemptive? What kind of redemption do we need, or justification of our lives? What is the problem in our lives that requires a justification or a redemption? Is there some kind of experience of reality that perhaps we're missing, that poetry can put us in touch with? And will that experience provide us with the sense that life is worth living, a justification of existence. Is existence justified only as an aesthetic phenomenon, as Friedrich Nietzsche famously said? And Nietzsche is someone who's one of many influences behind Stevens. So those are the sorts of questions I want to approach this. I will freely acknowledge that this is a naive, even an uncultivated reading. I'm like a barbarian picking up this book, okay? So you should be perfectly content to be such a naive barbarian as well, and to read it for your own pleasure, for your own insight, looking for, hungry perhaps for the kind of justification of existence, the kind of redemption, the kind of deeper experience, the kind of joy, even an ecstasy, that some people have come to expect from poetry. So, with that being said, let's get into the poem. Now, you'll want to call up the internet version of this poem. I think it's on genius.com, a website. I'm going to be reading directly from Stevens' collected poetry, so that's why I'm looking down here, just because I find it more gratifying to do that. To have the palpable book in my hands and to get in touch with the whole experience of reading poetry. That's the way I learned to do it. So I'm going to stick with that when it's possible for me to do so. And it just so happens, since I'm sitting here at the kitchen table, it's very comfortable for me to do it that way. Okay, let's have a drink. Well, let's start with the title. Notes Toward a Supreme Fiction. We can leave the A beside or to the sidelines here, but I think we want to dwell a bit on all of the other four words in this title because they're going to help provide us an approach to the poem that's at least a way of calibrating our expectations. So first of all, notes. In saying that this is just notes, already we have a kind of a deflation of our expectations. Notes in this, especially in an artistic context or literary context, is going to suggest these are preparatory sketches. These are, discrete, short attempts that may ultimately not lead anywhere, but that we're stringing together for some purpose. So ideas might also be another possible title. Of course, the idea of notes, or the word notes in English, also has another connotation because we naturally think of musical notes. So we can think of kind of the idea that the poet is trying to get the music of this supreme fiction into his ears, like an improvisational sort of compositional exercise. A songwriter at a piano just playing around on the piano, right? Or someone just picking at their guitar at 3 a.m, randomly trying to find a new melody to play. So in both those senses, that we should immediately expect that what we're going to encounter, even though this is a very long poem, it's not going to be a continuous narrative. It's not going to have a kind of classical or Aristotelian plot with a kind of organic unity, a beginning, middle, and an end, right? A problem that builds to a climax and then resolves and so on. It may have that, but we shouldn't expect it because it's notes. Also, it's notes toward a supreme fiction. So whatever this supreme fiction is, and we'll reflect on what that might be shortly, but this is just towards that ultimate end. This is not something that is to be understood as an achievement of a supreme fiction, but just notes toward it, preparing for it, laying the ground. What kinds of things would we want to be able to incorporate into a supreme fiction? And here it might be useful to think about, again, the way a composer of a symphony, or in the case of music, or a painter who has a very, commission to produce a very elaborate mural or something like that, might develop little sketches just as a way of beginning to think of, well, what are the kinds of things I would expect or want to be in this supreme fiction, in this supreme work, in this symphony, in this mural. So the notes towards is a phrase or a locution that goes together in that sense. They both suggest something that's provisional, that's temporary. And this is something that also, incidentally, has a long legacy within Romanticism and existentialism, which was also, towards the end of Stevens' life, it was becoming more and more a part of the development of Western culture, European culture, and then later on in America. The idea of the provisional and temporary character of all of our expressive endeavors, that we can't ever hope to, once and for all, have expressed ourselves perfectly, totally, that idea has become something that's no longer credible for us. The idea that there could be some ultimate overarching grand narrative, some ultimate overarching mythology that could make sense of everything for us. When we're going to be trying to produce those sorts of things, and maybe we need to as human beings in order to have a sense of meaning in our lives. But if we're going to try to produce that, the most we're ever going to be able to produce is just sort of partial, incomplete versions of that kind of thing. Okay, so fiction. Now, if you're coming off of the figure of the youth as virile poet and the expectation that poetry has to be concerned with truth and reality, then it might seem very counterintuitive to encounter this idea of a fiction. Except the idea of fiction here is compatible with the idea of providing a kind of myth that ultimately organizes and makes sense of our experience. And so the fiction here doesn't necessarily have to be false. It could be that it's just incomplete. And fiction in this sense only leads to a sense of falsehood if we view it as being complete, if we view it as being the last word, as opposed to just one story among many possible stories. There could still be truth in a fiction, because this fiction could tell us something about the nature of our reality, even if it doesn't tell us the whole story or isn't the last word on that. Now, that might be all well and good, but that very qualification seems to be negated when we add supreme to this fiction. So what's the supreme here going to be? What makes this, the highest? In what sense is it supreme? It suggests a kind of completeness. When I think of supreme, maybe this is reflective more about my particular priorities in life, but I always think of pizza. The supreme pizza, right? What's the distinctive feature of the supreme pizza? Supreme pizza is the one that has everything on it, right? Or at least all the good stuff. There's no pineapple on supreme pizza, but you got your pepperoni, you got your sausage, you got your onion, you got your green pepper, you got your mushrooms, you got your black olives, all that good stuff that the true connoisseurs of pizza like, right? It's got this kind of panoramic character. It gives you a sense of all of the possibilities, all the best stuff that you could put in a pizza. Now, I don't think Stevens had this in mind, but as I said, this is a personal reading. The supreme here very well could be a way of alluding to a kind of multicolored, multi-perspective fiction. So the various notes here are meant to fit together. They're meant to cover different approaches or different perspectives towards reality. They're not trying to necessarily cover everything, but they're trying to hit some of the important points. And to illustrate, to exemplify, to give examples of different types of desiderata, things that are desirable things that should be in a poem that is trying to provide something like the traditional ambition of poetry, which is a kind of bird's eye view, if not a God's eye view, then at least a bird's eye view of what humanity is, at least at a particular time or for a particular era. And so the supreme fiction here is going to be something like an analog for the traditional overarching guiding narrative, the overarching myth or mythos of a people, the central epic poem. But it's not going to be complete. It's not going to be final. It's just notes towards, it acknowledges freely its fictional status. It doesn't claim to be history. It doesn't claim to be something that is actually channeled from God. It doesn't claim to be something inspired by the muses. It claims to be just a fiction. So that's the situation that we are in perhaps our reduced circumstances in a disenchanted, demythologized age in which the gods have fled, in which God is dead, according to Nietzsche, right? That kind of idea. Okay, so much for the title. Then we have this dedication to Henry Church. Henry Church was a friend of Stevens and a kind of a patron of the arts, but it's not really, it doesn't really seem to fit him here. I mean, there seems to be something more going on, something broader going on. The first thing that naturally occurs to us is that if we look traditionally at ambitious poetry that attempted to kind of define its culture, to serve as the supreme fiction or the guiding mythos of the culture, these kinds of poets often would begin by a kind of an evocation of the muses or calling upon the spirit, that was going to provide it with its validity. And so that's, what you would naturally be led to expect if you're coming off of the tradition. What does Stevens say here? To Henry Church. And for what, except for you, do I feel love? Already off the bat, it seems to be odd that this, to this friend, he's saying that you're the only one I feel love for. What about his family? What about his, what about other people? So what's going on? For what, except for you, do I feel love? Do I press the extremist book of the wisest man close to me, hidden in me day and night? The extremist book of the wisest man. What does that refer to? The extremist book of the wisest man. Is this something like Nietzsche's Zarathustra, an extreme book, a book presenting extreme ideas of someone whose wisdom was supposed to be beyond everything else? Who is the wisest man? Socrates? Socrates didn't write. Plato, who wrote on Socrates' behalf? These are the kind of questions we should be asking. Do I press it close to me, hidden day and night? What's the answer to that question? In the uncertain light of single certain truth, why should single certain truth have an uncertain light? It seems that single certain truth should have a certain light. Unless this means something like we're uncertain that there is a single certain truth. Equal in living changiness to the light in which I meet you, in which we sit at rest for a moment in the central of our being, the vivid transparence that you bring is peace. Equal in the living changiness to the light in which I meet you. So the changingness in the living light this evokes to us this idea of change that is the quality for Stevens of both poetry and philosophy. Remember from the Figure of the Youth essay. So the uncertain light of the single certain truth is equal in the living changingness to the light in which I meet you. That is, there's truth in a certain kind of human relationship. And that's the certainest thing that we have. That's what that seems to be saying here. So if we're comparing this again with the idea that we're drawing upon inspiration from the muses as the traditional way to open an ambitious poem, then what he seems to be suggesting here is that the greatest certainty we have, the greatest inspiration we have, is something that takes place on the earth, in our interactions with those people that we make a connection with. It's a changing light. It may occur only as an epiphany for a moment, but when we meet and in which we are at rest, for a moment we're centered in our being. For a moment we've come at something we've come upon something that's true. The vivid transparency that you bring is peace, a kind of peace of the mind. This to me evokes the kind of peace that is often associated with the kind of religious vision. Think about the kind of peace that is, that we strive for when we're meditating in various traditions, trying to sort of quiet the mind so as to be able to focus. So maybe Stevens here is talking about the muse. The true muse is sort of anyone, not just Henry Churchill. This is an example, and obviously he's the person it's dedicated to. But whenever we're, in the presence of someone that we really connect with, that we love, and that we feel at home with and at peace with, there's a kind of centeredness that can occur. A kind of light that can, emit from that relationship, in which we attain a kind of state of peace, and perhaps out of that state is where poetry arises. So anyway, that's one way of reading this early dedication, and you may have your own. All right, so after this kind of drawing down, calling down of the muse, we have the beginning of the notes towards a supreme fiction. And the first section is entitled, "It Must Be Abstract." So we have these Roman numerals, which are usually designated as cantos in the discussion of such a poem, and then individual stanzas under each canto. So the first title is "It Must Be Abstract." Now this title, again, gives us pause, because if you're thinking of the supreme fiction as being something that must take the form of poetry, which seems to be, the whole point of this exercise of poetry as supreme fiction, then the first thing that we might expect is that poetry distinguishes itself from philosophy by not being abstract in the way that philosophy is, but by being concrete, right? By dealing with the particular as opposed to the universal. But that would be a mistake. Aristotle famously talked about poetry as being more philosophical than history, precisely because it is able to find the universal within the particular. So poetry is essentially essentializing. It's trying to find the essence that is contained within the particular example, something that makes the example truly exemplary for something broader. Think about the way in which typical, popular music could be described as abstract descriptions of the songwriter's love life, right? Typically, the person who's writing the song isn't saying, I, Joe Smith, had love affair with, Jane Doe, and we had this kind of interaction and so on. Rather, that particular relationship is taken up into a kind of medium of abstraction, where anyone can relate to it, and people feel like that pop song that's exactly describes our relationship, right? That's our song, as they used to say. So there's this sense that in that kind of a song, which is a form of poetry, it must be abstract. There has to be a way in which the particular instance gets translated into a medium of generality, where it applies to other instances as exemplary of those other instances as well. So that's just a starting point for the idea that it must be abstract. The supreme fiction must be abstract. This also points to a problem of the poet, which is, how do I translate my particular experiences into this medium of abstraction? How do I get at the essence? And in Stevens, I think there's also, later on we'll encounter this idea of what he calls the first idea, the sort of the original pure representation that gets beneath all of the different accretions, all of the different layers of interpretation that often that society puts onto things, right? That lead us to just to cliches and conventionality. How do we get beneath all that cliched and conventional interpretation back to the first idea of the thing? That's what the poet wants to do. The poet wants to get back to the first idea. The poet wants to, in that sense, abstract the first idea from all of this conventional cultural accretion, all of the cliche, all of the interpretation and reinterpretation and misinterpretation, to get to what's true, to get to what's real. Okay. First stanza, begin, Ephebae, by perceiving the idea of this invention, this invented world, the unconceivable idea of the sun. So the Ephebae is the young recruit. The Greek origin of the term is of a young man who is undergoing his first military training. As is still done in many countries, where after high school, before they begin college, young men and sometimes women are conscripted into the army and have to do, a year or two of compulsory military service, right? So the person who's in that state is the Ephebae, and this is pretty obviously a metaphor for the young poet. Right, Rilke wrote a famous letter to a young poet, and there is this kind of tradition within the history of Western poetry of the mentor who is going to be instructing, and really as a kind of mystagogue, an initiator into the mystery of the muse and how to be a poet. Right, so Stephen seems to be adopting this stance, and he says, begin by perceiving the idea of this invention, this invented world. So you want to invent a poem rather. That's a matter of inventing a world. So begin with the idea of an invented world. What is the idea of an invented world? The inconceivable idea of the sun. The inconceivable idea of the sun. What do we associate with the sun? I mean, there's a lot of symbolism laden over this idea. In Plato, the idea of the sun is the idea of the ultimate source. It's the source of being. It's the analog of the source of being. It's connected with the idea of the good, so the goodness of things, right? The value of things. Begin with the idea of sort of what's worthy, might be one way of understanding this. But if we think of it as this is the source, the sun is the source of life. It's what enables there to be any life on Earth. We also naturally then connect this with the origin of creativity. And so in the second stanza, he goes on to say, you must become an ignorant man again and see the sun again with an ignorant eye and see it clearly in the idea of it. Now that suggests to me Socrates' idea of the beginning of wisdom being an acknowledgement of your own ignorance, being aware that I know nothing, and the greatest impediment to true, genuine education is miseducation, thinking you know more than you do, thinking you know things about something when you don't really know anything about it, because unlike just pure ignorance, that kind of miseducation actually blocks you from even seeking out the education that you need, because you don't even know that you need it. You already think you think you already know. So Stevens is saying here, listen, young man, acknowledge your ignorance and see the sun again with an ignorant eye and see it clearly in the idea of it. Approach this source of life, this source of creativity, as if you don't know it, as if you're seeing it for the first time, as if you're Adam in the Garden of Eden and you've never seen the sun before. Don't think that you know the sun. Don't think that I'm already all familiar with what is possible, right? I'm already familiar with what's in the world. Next stanza. never suppose an inventing mind as source of this idea, nor for that mind compose of a luminous master folded in his fire. Don't suppose an inventing mind is the source of this idea. Don't suppose that you are the source of creativity. Don't suppose that a human mind is responsible for that. Recognize that you're in a passive receptive posture. Also, so don't adopt a kind of humanism, the ability, the belief that the human will, just by its own willing, can achieve anything, can invent a world. Recognize that that's an illusion. But there's another illusion too, and if humanism is an illusion, then so too is theism, whether polytheism or monotheism. Don't compose of a luminous master folded in his fire. Don't suppose that there's, that the sun is a god, the god Apollo. And he'll go on to refer to Phoebus, which is another name for the god Apollo. Apollo considered as the divine embodiment of the sun in Greek mythology. So don't suppose humanism, don't suppose either that there's some kind of divine source that you can access. How clean the sun when seen in its idea, washed in the remoted cleanliness of a heaven that has expelled us and our images. This is very much in line with Stevens's ambition as a poet, which is to see nature again purely, clearly, cleanly. In the cleanliness here is a cleanliness that's not influenced by all kinds of cultural presuppositions, whether they're Greek pagan or whether they're Christian. But just to see the sun, as see it purely and cleanly without all of this cultural baggage and interpretation on it. So to see nature without seeing nature painted over with all of these human interpretations. Okay? How clean it is when we can see it that way. The death of one god is the death of all. Let purple Phoebus lie in umber harvest. Let Phoebus slumber and die in autumn umber. Phoebus is dead, Ephebae, but Phoebus was a name for something that never could be named. There was a project for the sun and is. We're in a situation after the death of God. And the death of God here means not just the death of the Christian God, not just the death of some particular God of some particular theology, but of the disenchantment of nature. Right, all of that stuff lies on the ground. This idea of umber, right? Those of you who are into painting know all about burnt umber, and the sort of reddish brown color that's associated with the earth. All of that stuff dies. It's like dead leaves in the ground in autumn. All of the gods, picture all the gods strewn on the ground like a sea of bodies after a battle or a massacre. They're all dead on the ground in reddish brown decay. And what's left, though, is the pure vision of the sun that was obscured before by the gods. Imagine you're looking through a tree and all the rich foliage of all the different gods that human beings have invented throughout history that's blocking the clear view of the sun. I mean, you get the indirect view of the sun through the light that's coming through the trees. But now all of that has fallen to the ground. So it's a very ingenious image that it seems like he's employing here. And again, this is Stevens's realism. It's his naturalism. It's his idea that the task of the poet now is not to prop up some ancient religion, but rather to see things clearly and cleanly, purely, right, with purity and cleanliness. There is a project for the sun. The sun must bear no name, gold flourisher. Don't call the sun Phoebus. Don't give some kind of divine name to the sun. The sun must bear no name, gold flourisher. The sun is just a gold flourisher. But be in the difficulty of what it is to be. But be, let the sun be. And that's the hardest thing. To view things, it's a commonplace for us now that there is no naive perception. There is no pure vision that isn't colored by our prejudices, right? Unconscious biases always color our perception. The difficulty of just letting the sun be, of just letting anything in nature just be, and just seeing it for what it is. That's the task that takes the greatest exertion of the imagination. The difficulty of what it is to be. And there could be other senses of what difficulty here refers to, but I think that's probably one. Okay, so that's the first canto of It Must Be Abstract. Next, Canto II. It is the celestial ennui of apartments that sends us back to the first idea. The quick of this invention, and yet so poisonous are the ravishments of truth, so fatal to the truth itself. The first idea becomes the hermit in a poet's metaphors, who comes and goes all day. Okay, let's unpack some of that. The celestial ennui. So what's ennui? It's the sense of world weariness, sort of listlessness, lethargy, like the sense of not being motivated to do anything because what's the point, right? And a kind of boredom with life. The thrill of living is gone, and you just feel bored with life. That's kind of sense that's ennui. Now, celestial ennui. That's interesting. So celestial pertaining to the sky, of apartments. Is he talking here about, being in the city, the great modern cities, New York City, your apartment that's, 20 stories up, a deluxe apartment in the sky, as the theme song to the Jeffersons used to sing. Is that what he's describing? Like this, being in this little compartment, like a little bee in your beehive, and it's just boring. That sends us back to the first idea, that sends us to want to get back in touch with life, right? This suggests the way in which the transcendentalist Henry David Thoreau, who is deeply influenced by Ralph Waldo Emerson, who is also an influence on Stevens, talked about wanting to go to the woods in order to live deep and suck the marrow out of life, right? Life is his quarry. He's going to kill his quarry, eat all the meat of life, and then he's not going to leave anything to waste. He's going to even take the bone and suck the marrow out of the bone. Really live deep, so that when it comes time for me to die, I'm not sitting there on my deathbed regretting that I never really lived. So it sends us back to the first idea, the sense of the celestial ennui of apartments, this boredom of modern life, sends us back to the first idea. The quick of this invention, the quick here, you think about anyone who has ever had to trim their pet knows about the quick. You don't want to cut them to the quick, where the blood comes into the nail. Don't do that if you're trimming your cat's nails. It's a bad move. The quick of this invention, back to the source where the blood is coming into it, right? And yet so poisonous are the ravishments of truth. Interesting. Poisonous are the ravishment. These are negative terms, right? Poison, ravishment. It's a violent term. That in other words, you get so excited when you start to encounter real truth that isn't obscured by the various cultural baggage and forms of cultural baggage and interpretations that we layer onto things. You can get so, fired up and enthusiastic about that, so ravished by it, that it becomes fatal to the truth itself. Okay? This might suggest to us that passage in The Figure of the Youth as Virile Poet, when he talks about how the poet who has this sense of exaltation very naturally becomes a metaphysician. And you start to think that I must be united with the world's soul because I have had this great experience of expressing something that's actually true. And so God must be in me, or something like that. Or I must be united with nature, with some kind of metaphysical, mystical union. That's the kind of thing I think he regard as poisonous, because ultimately what you're doing now is falsifying what you experienced. The first idea becomes the hermit in a poet's metaphors, the hermit, right? Who's the hermit? The hermit is the person who is excluded from the common discourse, the common society. Right? The true insight is banished to some remote, undisclosed location. Who comes and goes all day. May there be an ennui of the first idea. Can we become bored with the first idea? Become bored with this idea of I've got this insight into reality. Do we become bored with that itself? where it no longer ravishes us to think, oh, I've hit on this perfect description of this piece of reality. But I do that all the time because I'm a great poetic genius. So it's natural for me to have this great insight, and to the point where it reminds me of I think during the 2016 presidential campaign where Trump talked about how we're going to be winning again as Americans, right? We're losing, we're getting taken advantage of by the Chinese and the Mexicans and the Canadians and the Europeans and all these people. But when I'm president, we're going to be winning again. We're going to win so much that we're going to get sick of winning, right? We're going to get bored with winning. An ennui of the first idea? Is there such a thing as the poet becoming bored with having these great insights? What else prodigious scholar should there be? Is he addressing scholars? Is he addressing ephebes here? I mean, it seems like what he's suggesting is that the more you sort of know, the more cultivated you become in literature and philosophy and all of these things, the less excited you get about discovering some new idea. So you've experienced this before. And so even though it's still something that you value, that you find useful, it's not something that necessarily would cause you to become enraptured. So again, this is that kind of typical deflationary move that Stevens likes so much, to pull us back down from our tendency to float up into the ether with metaphysical excitement. The monastic man is an artist. The artist is a monastic man. Is this an identity? The idea is that, the monastic, an ascetic, right? A kind of asceticism. Denying yourself pleasures, not letting yourself get too carried away. That's what the true artist is. The philosopher appoints man's place in music, say today, but the priest desires, the philosopher desires. And not to have is the beginning of desire. The priest and the philosopher are different from the poet. And this goes back to the essay that we talked about in the preceding two videos, is that the poet has what the philosopher and the priest desire. So the philosopher and the priest are the ones who like to philosophize about, the rapture of genius, about the rapture of the great insights that the poetic imagination is capable of. It's really the aesthetic philosopher who develops those kinds of theories, whereas it seems like what he's saying here is the true poet doesn't get fired up about that because the true poet has it, right? The true poet doesn't need to long for this genius, but possesses it. To have what is not is its ancient cycle. It is desire at the end of winter, but it observes the effortless weather turning blue and sees the myosotis on its bush. Being virile, it hears the calendar hymn. That's the virile poet here. It knows that what it has is what is not, and throws it away like a thing of another time, as morning throws off stale moonlight and shabby sleep. There's a suggestion here that really clearly equating the poet with nature. The poet's a part of nature, and the poet, bears the relationship to the discovery of a great poetic insight of genius in the same way that the spring bears a relation to the winter. The spring doesn't get all fired up that here I am, I'm spring, right? It flows naturally out of the winter, and so that there's this kind of natural, inevitable process that's involved in what poetry should be. Third canto. The poem refreshes life so that we share for a moment the first idea. It satisfies belief in an immaculate beginning. I think, based on what I've already said, that doesn't require additional commentary. And sends us winged by an unconscious will to an immaculate end. Sends us to an immaculate end. Towards a pure motivation, whatever that may be. the pure insight, the pure vision of reality. It sends us. This is a very ancient idea of the experience of the beautiful. The beautiful is not just something that fascinates us and dazzles us, but that it also calls us to some kind of action. Stereotypically, it calls us to some kind of sexual action, right? A desire to unite with what is beautiful. But it could be other things. It could call us to a kind of moral project. When we witness the actions of a very saintly person, that person's actions strike us as it's just beautiful. And we call them a beautiful soul, and we want to be like that person. So the immaculate beginning, but a kind of pure motivation, not something self-interested or egotistic. And sends us, winged by an unconscious will, to an immaculate end. We move between these points, from that ever-early candor to its late plural, and the candor of them is the strong exhilaration of what we feel from what we think, of thought beating in the heart as of blood newly came, an elixir, an excitation of pure power. There is an exhilaration to this poetic discovery. The poem, through candor, brings back a power again that gives a candid kind to everything. We say at night an Arabian in my room with his damned hoobla, hoobla, hoobla how, inscribes a privative astronomy across the unscrolled fours the future casts, and throws his stars around the floor. By day the wood dove used to chant his hoobla hoo, and still the grossest iridescence of ocean howls who and rises and howls who and falls. Life's nonsense pierces us with a strange relation. And thank God he ends by saying life's nonsense, because immediately by this point you're thinking, what is this? This is nonsense. And I think what he's describing here is this sense of a kind of vitality that isn't exceeds what we can make sense of and organize rationally in our mind. The image here of the Arabian, it's a kind of trope it's kind of metaphor for the exotic, right? What's beyond what we've experienced. And, these sort of nonsense syllables, hoobla, 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 how, which we find in the Arabian, which might be, the impression that someone speaking Arabic strikes someone who was raised in, the northeastern United States, as just speaking, unintelligible nonsense syllables, but that we might still appreciate rather by its musicality and the way we do the wood doves chant. But what this signals is that even though this may not speak to our intellect at all, it doesn't strike us as making sense. There's a kind of iridescence. There's a glow of fire. And there's a unity of form and content very clearly. Read these lines over again. They're exhilarating lines. It's just exhilarating rhetoric to listen to. Okay. Well, we haven't gotten very far in the poem, and I guess I'm not really sure how far we're going to get. But I'd rather dwell and give you a sense of how to read in a way that pleases you. I've been pleasing myself here, first and foremost. And I think that if you don't have that on poetry, it's not really worth doing the scholarly part. So hopefully what I've said is not invalid or untrue to Stevens's intentions and to the meaning that's contained in this. But actually here, just at the beginning, before the fourth canto of the first section, where he begins to talk about Adam and Descartes, it's a natural, reasonable stopping place. So we'll stop here for today, and then hopefully you can give some of your own impressions of this poem, what you found pleasurable in it or unpleasurable. And I encourage you to read it with an open mind and to provide some comments and feedback and to comment on each other's feedback. And we'll continue on with this beginning on Monday. So have a great weekend. Stay healthy.